There's a woman I once mentored. Let's call her Maya. From the outside, Maya looked like she was winning at life. She had a steady job, a circle of friends, and she knew every spiritual tool in the book. She woke early to meditate. She journaled every morning, pages of affirmations written in looping, hopeful ink. She lit candles, burned sage, whispered mantras into the mirror. Her friends admired her discipline. Her community called her committed. Her teachers praised her consistency. But inside something gnawed, because despite all the rituals, the journaling, the vision boards, her external reality barely moved. Her relationships looped in the same cycles. Money came and went in the same frustrating rhythm. Opportunities seemed to dance just out of reach. It was as if the universe was deaf to her devotion. And here's the truth she couldn't yet admit. She wasn't broadcasting the new self she kept writing about. She was still coded to the old self. This is what most people miss. The quantum field doesn't hear your words. It doesn't read your journals. It doesn't calculate how many affirmations you've recited. The field hears one thing only: the frequency of your identity. And if your old self, the one rehearsed for decades, is still running the show, then no amount of ritual can override it. Maya's affirmations said, "I am abundant." But her nervous system was still broadcasting, "I don't feel safe." Her vision board screamed, "I'm magnetic." But her body posture whispered, "I am unworthy." And the field, it didn't respond to the words. It mirrored the broadcast. Science explains this clearly. Every thought you think when charged with emotion wires into the body. Do it enough and your nervous system becomes addicted to the familiar frequency. That familiar state, whether scarcity, anxiety, or striving, becomes the operating system. So even as you declare a new intention, the body unconsciously broadcasts the old story. And the field, perfectly coherent, faithfully mirrors the broadcast back. This is why people loop. It's not that they're cursed. It's not that they're blocked. It's that their body is still coded to the familiar past. One morning, after her third failed manifestation challenge in as many months, Maya stared at her journal. The words felt empty. The affirmations felt hollow. The rituals felt like a performance. And something inside her whispered, what if the problem isn't the practice? What if it's the identity behind it? That question cracked her open, because for the first time she realized she wasn't creating as the future self. She was performing as the old one. Here's the paradox. Your new timeline will never deliver results to your old identity, and not because the universe is cruel, but because the field protects coherence. The field refuses to reward misalignment. It resists attaching outcomes to frequencies that cannot sustain them. It's not punishment, it's preservation. The field mirrors who you are, not who you're pretending to be. Maya saw it clearly. She wasn't being punished. She was being protected. Protected from manifesting outcomes she wasn't yet coherent enough to hold. But the old self doesn't leave quietly. The moment Maya slowed down, the old identity whispered louder. Check your phone. Look for proof. Push harder. You're behind. It tried to seduce her back into effort, into striving, into the familiar loop, because the nervous system clings to what it knows, even if what it knows is struggle. And this is where most people collapse. They mistake the pull of the old self as proof they've failed. But here's the breakthrough. That pull is not failure. It's evidence of the shift. The old self fights hardest when the broadcast begins to change. This is where Maya found herself. One path: return to the familiar identity, the one addicted to effort, the one that equated worth with doing. The other path: dissolve the old self and begin rehearsing a new identity, not as a performance, but as a lived broadcast. For the first time, she chose differently. Maya realized she had been treating manifestation as a checklist. Light the candle, say the mantra, write the affirmation. But the field wasn't listening to her checklist. It was listening to her coherence. So she asked a new question. Who am I before I start manifesting? Not what she wanted, not what she visualized, but who she unconsciously assumed herself to be. And the answer hit hard. She was still being the woman who needed proof to feel safe. That identity was her broadcast. And until it shifted, no ritual could override it. So Maya began small. The next time she felt herself spiraling, checking the clock, waiting for results, scanning for signs, she paused. She took a breath. She asked, what would the future me do right now? And in that pause, she interrupted the old identity. The future her wouldn't spiral. The future her wouldn't grasp. The future her would lean back, breathe, and radiate certainty. So she did. It felt awkward, unfamiliar, almost fake. But here's the paradox. Identity alchemy always feels fake at first, because your nervous system has rehearsed the opposite for decades. But fake is just another word for unfamiliar, and unfamiliar is the doorway to the new timeline. This was Maya's first taste of freedom. Not freedom from struggle, that would come later, but freedom from the illusion that rituals alone could shift her. She saw clearly identity is the real magnet. And when she began to alchemize the old self into the new, moment by moment, breath by breath, the broadcast began to shift. And the field had no choice but to listen. Maya's first experiment was small, a pause, a breath, a micro shift into a different version of herself. But it changed everything, because she realized identity alchemy wasn't a once-a-year breakthrough. It wasn't a grand ritual with candles, sound bowls, and endless affirmations. It was practiced in the smallest, most ordinary moments. We imagine manifestation is about the big declarations, the vision board sessions, the long meditations, the full moon ceremonies. But the field isn't listening most loudly then. The field listens when you're running late for work, when someone texts you something triggering, when money doesn't arrive on the date you wanted it to. It listens when you're brushing your teeth, scrolling Instagram, or sitting in traffic, because those are the moments where your unconscious identity leaks through. Those are the moments when your nervous system broadcasts the raw, unfiltered signal. And that signal is the one the field mirrors back. For Maya, the old identity showed up in disguise, not as obvious failure, but as subtle reactions. A sigh when she checked her bank account, a tightening in her chest when a friend succeeded, or a restless scroll through social media, looking for evidence that she was still on track. These weren't huge collapses, they were whispers. But whispers are enough, because the field doesn't measure intensity, it measures coherence. One subtle contraction is still a broadcast of lack. One tiny spiral is still an incoherent frequency, and the field mirrors it back, not to punish, but to protect coherence. Here's what's happening under the surface. Every thought fused with emotion wires a neurochemical loop. Over time, the brain fires faster along that loop until it becomes the default setting. The body follows. Muscles contract the same way. Breathing patterns repeat. Hormones fire in predictable rhythms. Your nervous system memorizes your identity. And here's the trap. The body doesn't know the difference between a real event and an imagined one. So when you keep rehearsing the emotion of the old self, fear, lack, striving, the body broadcasts it as if it's happening now. And the field echoes it back faithfully, without judgment. This hit Maya like a thunderclap. She wasn't manifesting what she wanted. She was manifesting who she was being. Her desires were irrelevant if her identity was incoherent. Because the field doesn't respond to what you want. It responds to what you are. And what you are is coded in your nervous system, rehearsed by your emotions, and broadcast in every micro moment of your day. So Maya flipped the script. Instead of spending 30 minutes visualizing outcomes she didn't feel yet, she began rehearsing emotions she could embody now. Not, I will be abundant, but what does the version of me who already is abundant feel like? She would sit in stillness and ask, how would my body breathe if I already had it? How would my shoulders rest if I already was it? How would my face soften if I no longer needed to chase it? And then she would breathe that way, rest that way, soften that way, not as a performance, but as a rehearsal. And slowly, the rehearsal became real. At first, it felt fake. Of course it did. Her old self had decades of practice rehearsing lack. Her new self was only a few breaths old. But here's the paradox. Fake is just another word for unfamiliar. And unfamiliar is the only doorway into the new timeline. So she kept going, breathing, softening, practicing the frequency of her future self until her body began to accept it as familiar. And once the body accepts it as familiar, the field has no choice but to mirror it back. Think about it. If the field is a mirror, then the most important part of manifestation is not the external ritual, but the internal posture. Your nervous system is the real script the universe reads. So if your body is still wired to contraction, striving, or lack, that's what gets mirrored. But if your body rehearses peace, safety, and wholeness, even before evidence arrives, then the field mirrors that instead, and timelines collapse. Maya started noticing the moments her old self tried to sneak back in. When she wanted to rush a reply to prove her worth. When she felt the urge to check her phone for signs. When she started bracing against imagined failure. Each time she paused, she asked, would the future me feel urgency right now? And the answer was always no. So she didn't. She sat back. She smiled. She embodied coherence instead of contraction. One decision at a time. And those micro decisions began building a new posture, an energetic immunity to her old self. Here's the irony. Maya thought she needed to add more rituals, more tools, more practices. But identity alchemy wasn't about doing more. It was about doing less and pausing in the moments that mattered most. Because coherence isn't built in performance. It's built in pauses. The pause before you react. The pause before you spiral. The pause before you collapse back into the old frequency. Those pauses are where the alchemy happens. Within weeks, subtle changes appeared. Her conversations felt lighter.
Her decisions felt clearer.
Her body carried a quiet confidence she hadn't felt in years. And soon after, external shifts began showing up. A surprise client reached out. An unexpected check arrived in the mail. An invitation aligned perfectly with her vision. She hadn't chased.
She hadn't forced.
She hadn't performed. She had simply shifted identity. And the field had no choice but to rearrange itself around her. This is identity alchemy. Not faking until you make it.
Not forcing until it arrives.
Not performing for alignment, but rehearsing moment by moment the posture of the future self until your body broadcasts it as familiar. Because when your identity shifts, your frequency shifts, and when your frequency shifts, your timeline shifts. The old self dissolves, the new self takes root, and the field begins to echo your coherence instead of your contradiction. Maya's world began to shift. Not in fireworks, not in dramatic explosions of success, but in subtle, undeniable ways. A different posture in her body, a softer tone in her voice, a steadier rhythm in her breath. These weren't just small wins. They were signals.
Signals that her nervous system, once addicted to scarcity and striving, was finally recalibrating to safety, wholeness, and sufficiency.
And as her inner broadcast changed, her outer reality had no choice but to follow. Now, don't get me wrong. The old self didn't just vanish. It still whispered. It still tugged. It still tried to seduce her back into urgency. But here's what Maya realized. The old self doesn't die because you will it away. It starves because you stop feeding it. Every time she paused instead of spiraled, the old loop weakened. Every time she breathed instead of braced, the old frequency lost charge.
Every time she chose coherence instead of contraction, the old self grew fainter.
And slowly, the voice that once dominated her reality became background static. And here's where the real transformation happened. Maya began noticing the world around her was still chaotic. The news was still broadcasting fear. Friends still complained about scarcity. Society still screamed, "Do more, be more, prove more." But none of it touched her. It was as if she had built a shield around her. Not a wall, not avoidance, but immunity. Because when your frequency is coherent, the lower frequencies of the 3D world lose their power. They can knock at your door. They can shout from the sidelines, but they cannot penetrate your field. This is energetic immunity, not numbness, not indifference,
but sovereignty.
Most people try to escape their triggers. They change environments, cut people off, avoid situations. But Maya realized immunity wasn't about avoiding, it was about outgrowing. When you shift your frequency into higher octaves, peace, love, certainty, wholeness, the old triggers simply stop landing. They no longer resonate. They no longer pull you down. They bounce off your field like arrows hitting water. That's real freedom. But there was still one more layer Maya had to learn: surrender. See, even after her shifts, a part of her still peeked at the field, still asked, "Is it working?" Still looked for confirmation. And that subtle checking was just another broadcast of lack. Then one evening, sitting quietly in her room, she heard it, a voice, not from outside, but from within. It said, "Stop waiting, stop checking, stop asking. You already are." And in that moment, she surrendered. not in defeat, not in exhaustion, but in freedom. She stopped scanning the horizon for results. She stopped begging the universe to prove itself.
She stopped bargaining with timelines.
And she leaned back into the now. This was the greatest revelation of all. The field never needed her effort. It never needed her hustle. It never needed her to prove alignment through rituals and routines. It only needed one thing: coherence born of freedom. Because freedom is the highest frequency. Freedom from needing the result. Freedom from attaching worth to evidence. Freedom from chasing timelines. When she surrendered into freedom, her frequency became undeniable. And the field, faithfully coherent, began mirroring that freedom back in synchronicities, opportunities, and effortless alignment. So what did Maya's life look like now?
She still meditated, but not to get somewhere. She meditated to enjoy coherence.
She still journaled, but not to prove worth. She journaled to express gratitude for what already was. She still set intentions, but no longer from lack. She set them from overflow. Her external reality, it shifted rapidly. New clients appeared with ease. Her finances stabilized without struggle. Relationships deepened with honesty and lightness. But the real shift wasn't what she gained. It was what she lost. She lost the weight of proving. She lost the urgency of becoming. She lost the desperation of lack. And in its place, she carried an anchored certainty, a new identity that the field could not ignore. Here's the secret Maya now embodied. The field doesn't reward your striving.
It reflects your being.
And when you no longer need to prove, chase, or beg, you finally become coherent enough for timelines to collapse. You stop broadcasting lack.
You stop confusing the signal.
You stop performing for alignment, and you simply are. So now I ask you, the one listening, who are you before you start manifesting? Not what do you want, not what do you visualize, but who do you unconsciously assume yourself to be? Because that identity is the code the field translates. And until you alchemize it, your old self will keep broadcasting a frequency that blocks the very future you're asking for.
But the moment you shift, even in small pauses, even in micro decisions, the broadcast changes.
And the field has no choice but to rearrange itself around you. This is identity alchemy, not adding more effort, not stacking more rituals, not trying harder to convince the field, but subtracting the noise, interrupting the old identity, rehearsing the new one until it becomes your baseline. Because when you shift identity, you shift frequency. And when you shift frequency, you shift timelines. The old self starves. The new self, and the field, faithful, coherent, inevitable, mirrors you back in full. So let this be your declaration.
I am the signal, not the seeker, not the performer, the signal.
Say it, feel it, broadcast it. Because once you do, your old self can no longer seduce you. The world can no longer manipulate you. And your future has no choice but to collapse into your now. If you are still listening and found this valuable, let me know in the comments section.